All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Um, First of all, if you scroll up to if you're at the top in the nest, if you scroll up there to the far right, you're going to see a little mini thread that a really good friend of mine, uh, dominated by Dig Dug, did about Plutarch. Uh, Dig Dug is the go-to guy on all things Greek and Latin, along with my other very dear friend, Ancient Philosophy. Because what we're gonna see is that the translations into English of Plutarch are especially problematic, all of them. And really, the only good translations are the ones that are mostly out of print. From, I mean, the older the better. So I wanted to add that first. Secondly, Ancient has my friend Ancient, he has done a number of recorded spaces on Plutarch, Plutarch on a number of Plutarch's various writings. Now I have these on my Athens Corner website. So for anyone who's interested in this topic, uh, this is sort of a, a subsection of overlapping series that I'm doing on my website, and one of them is American history, or what you could call American studies, or something like that. I haven't decided what I want to call it. I'm doing a whole series on the reception of philosophy into America, which is going to encompass everything from Christianity, et cetera, to philosophy. That's in the works. This also overlaps with my series on Nietzsche, which I'm redoing in its entirety. I'm working on a recording right now. I'm editing it up, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. Hopefully, it'll be able to get released in about a week. And also, it's going to overlap with a series that I intend to release. I've been telling people I'm going to release it for a while, but it's sort of like my child, on Plato's Laws, an entire series on Plato's Laws. We're also going to see, by the way, how this relates to Thucydides. And my pinned tweet on my profile, I've made that recording on Thucydides free. And everyone really enjoyed that one. I have the sequel to that one as well, by the way, is about to be released. I'm working on that one and the Nietzsche one together so that I can release them together. I think you're really going to enjoy that one because I cover the end of the archaeology going into Thucydides' turn to speeches. And that's going to have relevance for us today in this discussion. But I thought this was just a good idea because 4th of July with the founding. I mean, this is the one time. This is sort of the day in American history when we celebrate unity in the sense of patriotism. Right? We're celebrating the fact that we're not slaves or something like that to another people. And the role of Plutarch is so crucial in all this because he provided our founders with so very, very much of what they needed to get this thing up and running, and also their opponents. So you have, for instance, the Federalists, and then you have the AntiFederalists. We're going to see that Plutarch, in many respects, is what unites them and also divides them in a few particular lives because of what they were trying to what both groups were trying to accomplish. Now, it's it's so difficult to sort of know where to begin here. I have a couple pages in notes. Now, I promise I'm going to keep this one short. I've decided that I will not, at the absolute most, I'll go like an hour and a half. And if I haven't covered everything, then it's over. Then it's like, come subscribe to my website, because I can't just, I would love to do this stuff for free all the time. But that doesn't pay the bills. And that's the problem. So, and I don't really do spaces too much anymore because I'm spending so much of my time working on these various projects for the website, and they take an enormous amount of time and research on my end. So there's a couple ways to start now. The great guys at the New Thinkery, Alex Priot, Greg McBrayer, and David Barr, Those guys have a recorded episode on Theseus, who we're going to talk about today. And it's very good. It's always worth your time listening to those guys. And so when I was thinking about this, because see, one of the things that I do that I really enjoy almost more than kind of making the series is for the website is I do personal tutoring through the by way of my website. And anyone who's interested, just send me a DM. And two clients in particular, one of them I've just been working with Machiavelli on recently. And prior to that, we were working on Xenophon. And the other one, I'm working with strictly with Plutarch on these things. And we had a great discussion just yesterday, he and I. And so I have a number of notes about this. And in preparing just for, the talking with him and sharing with him about these things, I mean, it's very difficult for us to understand what we are holding in our hands when we simply open Plutarch, right? Why Plutarch? And there's a number of reasons why, and I'm gonna get to that. And so that's sort of the great divide. Do we begin by just looking at Theseus and Romulus from Plutarch, or do we need a kind of elementary foundation so that we understand why we are looking at them? Because something new is under the sun that has altered everything, literally everything. And that's the study of history as we understand it today, scientific history. That's also going to be a very prominent theme in this discussion. It needs to be a theme in this discussion. That's why I've titled it this space, Founders and Greatness. The word greatness is rather, I've been doing a number of series spaces on greatness going back the past few months because we don't really know what it is anymore. It's the whole purpose of the Enlightenment in many respects was to sort of level the playing field so that everyone is considered equal. To turn people into, as Nietzsche refers to, sand, just small grains of all identical sand, right? We're all tapioca. I run into this a lot with some of the younger guys who just, they don't have, for instance, the kind of education background that I do, and they just don't like the fact that apparently that I know more about particular topics than they do. And it angers them that they don't know different languages or something, and then they start railing against it. Railing against me or something like that, which is just laughable. We should see these opportunities of greatness as, well, exactly that, opportunities for us to become better ourselves. I would not be the person I was or am if I didn't always recognize that, right? I mean, you don't just see someone and want to just tear them down. You say, okay, do they actually have a point? And if they do, why didn't I have it first? And if I didn't have it, where do I go to learn it? And how can I learn it? Same thing with physical fitness, etc. So that's the way to go. So you see a lot of this on some very poisonous posting was taking place yesterday about the various religion of the founders in America and things like that, and very, very poisonous. I'll deal with that in a separate space, though. It's very easy to handle that. But this is how we need to understand this. And so another way to think of it, greatness, is in many ways people think of something like the hero or like the anti-hero or something like that. I'm really not a fan of that word either, because we just need to clarify what exactly we're talking about. We're talking about the virtues, human excellence, right? And see now you're no longer in the realm of these vague things that you can, these vague concepts where people say, well, it's, greatness is this, or, heroes are this and anti-heroes are this. And no. Let's clarify. Let's get down to the brass tacks and what we're talking about here. So that's going to help us understand what's going on with Plutarch. What has happened is that the Greek polis has failed. And so the question that Plutarch is considering, one of the many questions, but it's just something we have to get a bearing here. One of the things that Plutarch is looking at is, okay, what do we have as a guide going forward if, as all indications seem to be, the small polis, the city-state, or whatever you want to call it, is no longer an option. The world has become much smaller, and some kind of universal rule is going to be needed going forward, or some kind of rule for much broader people going forward is needed. That's why you have the title is or we could say the title is the imminent lives of the Greeks and the Romans, which is to say that the greatness of a select few of the Greeks and a select few of the Romans, and their parallel, which is to say he places them in juxtaposition. And so he tells us all about a great Greek, then he decides to pair that with a particular great Roman of his choice. And so we have those two accounts, and then he gives us a kind of juxtaposition. So it's like three books for each one, right? Or something like that. Now, the question though is why, right? I mean, why? So, I mean, why these particular people? What's so special about them? Well, again, I mean, that speaks to their greatness, we could say, or their heroic stature, or better, I think, the quality of their virtues, right? Or we could say the nature of their virtues. What is it about their virtues that stands out? And that's going to be that, speaking of it in terms of virtue, that's going to really capture why it is that Plutarch has left such an amazing legacy and influence on us as a people. Because the thing about virtue, and this is something that Aristotle tells us in the Nicomachean Ethics, the thing about virtue, and he says this when he brings up the first virtue that he's going to talk about, which is courage. See, again, because we're being very precise with our terminology. We're not talking about greatness anymore. We're not talking about heroism. We're actually talking about human excellence. That's what the Greek word for virtue is, arete. It means excellence. And the very specific excellence is courage. And then there's going to be a number of other ones. And we have to consider how all these things come together, or how we could say, as Aristotle phrases it, they form a cosmos, right? A constellation. And either they're in harmony or they're in tension with each other. Now 2 points about that. The first virtue that Aristotle brings up is courage. Now, there's a reason for that. These aren't disordered. They're not haphazard. Because you can't have any virtue without courage. There's something about courage that's required in order to have virtue itself, right? In other words, virtue just doesn't come natural to most people. We have to overcome things within ourselves that are uncomfortable. We could say uncomfortable truths, weaknesses, things that we're lacking. We have to look these things with very clear eye in the mirror and say, okay, I see you. I know the full scope of you. You're in me. Now, what am I going to do to surpass that, to get through that? And what Aristotle says about courage almost immediately is he says the telos of virtue, the moral virtues, is the beautiful. Now, that's something that's amazing. I mean, just think about that for a minute, because now this is a kind of almost what we could say is a kind of a concept. We don't really know how to put the beautiful into words, but the fact that human excellence, its purpose, its telos, is the beautiful, that's what reaches in us and grabs a hold of us, right? That's the kind of that's the reason, for instance, you get the shot of adrenaline when you're lifting and you're, you've got your headphones on and it's just you're in the zone. It's because we just we recognize when we're in the presence of excellence, or we recognize when we are aiming or working very hard towards excellence. And that's what's so captivating about it. That's what's so intoxicating about it. Now, it's going to turn out that for Plutarch, his discussion of founders, which is the parallel lives of, at least, I mean, there are a number of them, but it's the parallel lives of Theseus and Romulus. That's going to be definitive of Theseus, because something about that is going to show through spectacularly with what he establishes, which is to say Athens. There's going to be a difference there with Rome, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Let me just simply say this. What happens now, because our founders in America are so influenced because of that kind of excellence that they find in their own tradition, right? Greece and Rome, from Plutarch, they have to wrestle with that. The telos, or the goal, or the aim, the purpose, we could say, of virtue being the beautiful, because that might actually have to change, because the world has changed, right? It's no longer these small Athens, right? It's these large Romes, or maybe even imperial Rome, something like this. And that's the whole point of, well, one could say that that's, in many respects, at least one of the most important points about Plutarch, is he's providing us these juxtapositions because he wants us to be able to clarify what we understand as the very nature of a broader, or we could even say a universal rule going forward. In other words, universal governance or something like that, empire, something to this effect. That's not to say that he's advocating for it. It's just to say that that's on the radar. We could even go further and say, in many respects, everything is sort of centered at, or points back towards, or points forward in the direction of, in Plutarch, the juxtaposition on the one hand of Alexander the Great, and on the other hand, Julius Caesar. These are two kinds of universal rule, but the natures of which are very different. But that's what's so wonderful about Plutarch, is it doesn't have to be just those two, right? Because you're going to find in a whole host of these other lives these things. But because of that, and this gets to one of the tweet that I sort of just sent out, and it got all kind of reception. And I was like, I should probably do a space on this, which is that in the Federalist Papers, the most quoted classical author of all classical authors by the Federalists is Plutarch. So, keeping that in mind, what happens with the change in the scope, these political communities being much larger, no longer being just the polis, and what they're going to establish, the quality or the character of the larger forms of these things, either the polis expanded, we could say, is going to end up being commerce, trade, self-interest. What's going to happen is that the Federalist, the authors of the Federalists and all of the founding fathers are going to have very serious, very clear-eyed discussions of what the purpose of civic virtue is and is going to be going forward. And Jefferson, and one of his letters, it's October 14th of 1816. It's Jefferson to Adams. I mean, you just have to read these letters between Jefferson and Adams, really any of the founding fathers, because they're speaking, they're using the Greek in communications with each other, which is just fascinating. And Jefferson flatly says, I don't know if we're going to be able to have this thing, takala, or tokalon. In other words, that's the Greek for the beautiful, as the telos, or the goal of virtue, right? In fact, he's going to say that is what has caused so many problems, is that people become so intoxicated with the beautiful that it not only disorients and disrupts, but it is the dissolution of various governments. And one of the examples he uses that I think is very powerful and quite persuasive, really, is he says, look what happens in marriages. He says, you don't let young people just go off and, decide that they're going to get married to whoever they fall in love with, some beautiful woman. That's crazy. The parents have to have a say-so in this because there's this kind of madness to youth that can go astray. And they're saying, look at what's happened to the various kinds of governments that this has happened to. And this, by the way, is going to be what we see in Shakespeare's Greek plays. In particular, this is the problem with what happens to Rome after Caesar. Mark Antony is going to become basically the sock puppet of Cleopatra. And in Shakespeare's play on this, Antony and Cleopatra, it's Barbarous, if I remember correctly. Barbarous is the one who says to Mark Antony, he has to go to Egypt to talk to him. He's not even in Rome. He says, sir, the rumor in Rome is that Rome is ruled by a woman. In other words, because Mark Antony is such a cuck, as they say, to Cleopatra, you would not have seen something like that with Caesar. But that's how these things show themselves politically, at least. Now, again, just sort of going back here for a moment, because so much is going to come tumbling out of this understanding of how it is that Plutarch sustained that legacy of providing us, and I want to be very, very precise with my language here, images of excellence, which is to say the beautiful in its most, I'm inclined to say in its most noble form, but that's kind of silly because that's sort of the Department of Redundancy department, because in Greek, the beautiful can be translated as the noble as well, or fine, or something like that. So what it is the reason that the beautiful captures us so much is because more than anything else, the beautiful holds out the promise of complete intelligibility. It's in our language when we talk about love. Just listen to when you hear people say, you complete me, right? In other words, it's so beautiful that I can wrap my arms around it and I'm complete. In other words, full intelligibility of one's own life. That's what the beautiful holds out as a promise. Now, whether or not that's true, that's a question. That gets us into, in many respects, what Plutarch is up to, and certainly what Plato and Aristotle were up to. But you also find this in Thucydides, etc. Because the question is it the case that the beautiful... See, we always want to believe that the skin of the good is the beautiful. But what happens if that's not the case? Because, you can see it just on Twitter. There are many beautiful people who are, in fact, not good. You don't want to see beneath the surface. You don't want that. In many cases, also, there is the good, which is, it's not beautiful. This is going to be a very serious issue with the tension that arises in, for instance, Aristotle's inquiry into this notion of what virtue is. But it turns out, and I could go into this. I do go into this in great detail in one of my recent recordings for the Technology and Nihilism series. It's like 4 hours worth of recording with Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics on the one hand, and Plato's Dialogue, the Gorgias on the other, and then Martin Heidegger sitting in the background. All of this on the topic of technology. But it turns out that what Aristotle tells us almost at the very end of the text is that the many don't even have a conception of the beautiful. That is a huge problem, because he told us at the very beginning that the telos of the moral virtues is the beautiful. And then he told us at the very end, right as he's entering into a discussion about law and politics, that the mass of men simply have no conception of the beautiful. And in fact, I can even be more specific here. I do want to just read this passage, because this is going to distinguish the founders and why they had such an appreciation for Plutarch. This is, I've written the page number down in the translation, but I did not include the proper textual citations. Let's see, it's 229 page number. Because what he's going to tell us is that we want to believe that if we can just provide education to these people, right, if we can show them the beautiful, then it will resonate with them. But that's not the case. That's certainly the premise of all education, certainly of modern education. But that was not even the case even for Plato or Aristotle. That's the whole purpose of the education of the so-called philosopher kings in the Republic. You've got to find people that have the right kind of natures to their soul. This is what Aristotle says. This is Book 10, Chapter 9. He's almost completely done. Now, remember, he's going to be talking about speeches or logoi. That's what we need to understand is being provided to us by Plutarch, right? I mean, Plutarch is providing us his speeches, his accounts of these great people. And Aristotle says the following. He says, if speeches were sufficient by themselves to make people decent, then they, the people, in other words, would justly fetch much pay and great. As Theonis has it, he's talking about this very, very famous wrestler or grappler, Theonis. And he says, and one ought to pay it. So what he says is that if it were true that speeches by themselves had the power to make people decent, then absolutely not only should you pay people that can provide you or teach you the speeches, but you should not even care how much it costs. He says, but as things stand, speeches appear to have the capacity to exhort and to incite those youth who are free. Now, this is the word we would otherwise use for liberal, right? Liberal education. He says, as things stand, the speeches do work. They do work, but only under these very specific conditions, that the youths that hear them are free. In other words, they have leisure. And he says, and to make someone who has a well-born character and someone who is truly a lover of what is beautiful, receptive to virtue. He says, yet speeches are incapable of exhorting the many to the beautiful and the good. He says, for the many are not naturally obedient to the governance supplied by a sense of shame. He says, but instead, they're only obedient to that which supplies fear. And they do not naturally abstain from base things because of shamefulness involved. In other words, they're shameless. They don't care. He says, but they do abstain from things because of the vengeance that may be exacted. That's about as clear-eyed as you can possibly get on the nature of realpolitik. You're going to be hard-pressed to find anything even in Machiavelli that rivals that. Now, this, by the way, is going to be one of the reasons that both the founders, the Federalists and the AntiFederalists, were rifling through Plutarch for pseudonyms. And it's probably why it is the case that, for instance, Alexander Hamilton probably is the one who came up with the pseudonym Publius, because of exacting revenge on the last of the tyrants out of Rome, right, to get them the hell out, to reestablish themselves as a free people. And that's what you're going to see. Hamilton, by the way, was probably the most successful of all of the, not just the Federalists, but the Anti-Federalists in adopting the various pseudonyms. That's why it's so laughable when you see these people on X mock anons. They say, well, if you know, I don't take you serious because you haven't put your name out there. You don't have any real stake in the game or anything. You just, you could just be a troll or a nobody. Why should I listen to you? Well, both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, in other words, to establish the first government ever under these Enlightenment ideals, they lived with the pseudonyms because the pseudonyms meant something. First of all, they were risking their life. And second of all, the pseudonyms themselves were very, very important. Phocion, by the way, is going to be one of the most important, who comes directly from Plutarch. If you haven't heard of him, you should grab a copy of Plutarch and take a reading there. A good friend of mine has already stolen that anon name long since for X. But this name, Phocion, was very, very important for the Federalists for exactly these particular reasons of the fact that the beautiful only has contact, right? It only resonates with particular kinds of people. And they were they understood this completely. Now, let me point something out here. I'm undecided how I want to do this. I am going to call it a hard quit, despite not being able to really get into the amount of Theseus and Romulus that I wanted to, because you have to provide this kind of entryway, because we today are so poorly educated. We don't know. We don't know why it is that we should even care about Plutarch. Whereas in the 18th century, and spanning all the way back to Plutarch, everyone who was educated read these people. But something happened between the 18th and throughout the 19th century. And again, that's the discovery, or not so much, it's not really a discovery. This is nothing new. This has been going on for a very, very long time. Most people just have no clue about it. But how it was the case that history becomes scientific. And one of the primary reasons for this was to break free from, on the one hand, the censorship of the various theology departments, the theology faculty altogether, and on the other hand, to break free of the philosophy departments, because the philosophers had been doing all kinds of meddlesome things with history as well. And the one person who stands out the most, because in many respects, he's the culmination of all of this, and he puts an end to it in many respects, for good or for ill, is Nietzsche. And this is Nietzsche's famous statement about it. He says, I'm trying to figure out where I want to even begin reading this. This is there's a number of places I could be in. This is from his Untimely Meditations. This is his second essay on the use and disadvantage of history for life. But he's just the first meditation, and again, being untimely. In other words, it's timeless. In other words, it's not something that is within the purview per se of the deleterious effects of making history scientific. And the first essay was about David Strauss, who was the first one to publish really the culmination of the greatest achievement in human history regarding education, which is to say the field of philology. And he was the first to publish what he titled initially as a 700 or 800 page tome of, it was the first historical account of Jesus. And it's in the title, it says it's the Gospels, based solely on science or scientific methods. And what he concludes based on scientific methods is that there was no Jesus. I mean, it's just not there according to the science. And now his life story, by the way, is just fascinating. But again, let me emphasize, I cover all of this in my upcoming recording on Nietzsche. I mean, you're really going to enjoy it. I go all the way back to as far as back as this goes, and then I trace it. I mean, I think I've got at least an hour and a half just on the account of how all of this leads up to Nietzsche. But this is what he says. This is at the end of section 6 of the second essay. He says, draw around yourself the fence of a great all-embracing hope, of a hopeful striving. He says, create within yourself an image to which the future should conform, and forget the false conviction that you are just epigones. Now, again, this is all related to Plutarch because that's the whole purpose of the pseudonyms of the Federalists, right? And the AntiFederalists. He says, you have enough to ponder and invent by pondering that future life. He says, but do not ask history to show you how and by what means. He says, if instead you begin to immerse yourself in the histories of great men, he says, then you will derive from them the supreme commandment of becoming mature and escaping the paralyzing education spell cast upon the present age. He's talking about it's like scientific history is like an acid bath upon the sacred truths. Nothing survives. Nothing survives. But now I have to qualify that. There are premises being made by modern science that are themselves very, very questionable. This is where things become very fun. Now, again, I'm going to all of that in my recordings and such for the Athens Corner website. That I think you would it's absolutely fascinating. Literally all of this, by the way, comes tumbling out of trying to figure out just how to read the Bible. I mean, if you can believe it, all of this has come tumbling out from this centuries-long effort to try to understand the Bible. And he says, he's talking about the spell that's been cast upon them. He says, forget about all that. You've got to just search through the lives of great men. And he says, the spell that's been cast on you, that sees its utility in preventing you from becoming mature so that it can master and exploit you in your immaturity. He says, and if you are looking for biographies, he says, then please ignore those whose titles sound the tiresome refrain of Mr. So-and-so and his age, right? I think that's hilarious. How many times have you read, for instance, Plato and his age, or, I mean, just pick anything, right? Frederick the Great and his age, right? Or his era, his time. Now, make no mistake about it, however, there's enormous depth to what's being said here because we just think it's kind of funny and laughable. Nietzsche was a classically trained philologist, and not just any classically trained philologist. He was the most respected in Germany at the height of their, just like I said, the greatest creation of human education. And at age 24, he was given a professorship as a philologist. And so when he's mocking these people, saying, don't read, Mr. So-and-so in his age, he is directly committing mutiny to the field of classical philology. But again, I go into all of that with just extreme amounts of meticulous examination through his own text and through the various texts of the people that he's has in mind here, along with the legacy of where those people are coming from in this upcoming Nietzsche recording. But he says, instead, choose biographies whose title page reads, "A fighter against his age." Now, he primarily has Hegel in mind here, but make no mistake about it, he absolutely has the culmination of the greatness of Germany at this time, as far as universities are concerned, in mind. He says, satiate your souls by reading Plutarch. He says, and dare to believe in yourselves by believing in his heroes. I have to check the German on that. I'm not quite sure it's heroes. I think it might be their greatness. He says, with 100 such unmodernly educated men, he's talking about the youths here. And he says, that is, men who have matured and grown accustomed to the heroic. Again, I need to check the German on that. He says, the entire noisy sham cultivation of this age could be silenced once and for all. Now, it's actually more explicit. I know for a fact in the German, it's what he's saying is it's not that we can just put an end to it right now in our era. What he's saying is we can put an end to it forever. You can create something that's enduring. That gets us back to essentially the whole point of Plutarch's Theseus and Romulus, but I'll get to that in just a moment. I do want to point one thing out at this point. Notice what he said there is that if you can believe in those things, right, satiate your souls in those things, he goes, then you just might be able to pull off this miracle of putting an end to all of this nonsense forever. Now, that's what the founders were doing. I'm trying to find exactly where I have this. I've got so many books in front of me right now because this project, of course, I allowed it to spiral out of control. But it's Adams, John Adams, who flatly says, when I read them, I feel like I'm reading about my contemporary times. So I feel like I'm reading about right now. Now, of course, he hadn't even read Nietzsche or anything. I don't even know if at that point, I think Nietzsche had published, but there was the Americans hadn't. I mean, they certainly didn't know. But that's the spirit of how these things work, right? That's the spirit of how human excellence works. If you can really believe in it, then you start to see it where it is, and you hadn't noticed it previously. And that's the real engine of human history. Right? That's what it is. It's not going to be any of these sort of philosophical things or something like that. Now, that being said, the issue here becomes fascinating because it's Machiavelli. So the tradition from which this comes up most especially, at least that I'll point out, is from Machiavelli to Hobbes, then to Rousseau, then to Montesquieu. And with Montesquieu, we're up and running with all the Federalists because the most quoted classical author in the Federalist Papers is Plutarch. The most quoted modern author in the Federalist Papers is not John Locke, it's Montesquieu. And it's very, very fascinating what they have to say about these things. So in other words, why does this happen? Well, in many respects, I'm skipping over the Renaissance. Please don't misunderstand. That's crucial. I mean, that's everything really, because it's the whole point that we have this new learning that comes to us from the East into Christendom that launches so very, very much of all of this discussion with regard to the text and the new learning that we receive. And so in many respects, Machiavelli, much like Nietzsche, is the culmination. So he's not the beginning, he's the end of a tradition that's already been going on. For instance, many people say that the Renaissance or humanism begins with Petrarch. That's not true. There was at least already 70 years that had gone by. There was already at least a 70-year tradition of the moderns, we could say, or the new learning that Petrarch was working in. So similarly, so in the same sense that Machiavelli is in many respects the culmination and begins a new beginning. Well, I meant to say in the same way that Nietzsche does is the culmination and marks a new beginning from there on, because he puts an end to all of it because he's just so persuasive. So too is Machiavelli with regard to this with Plutarch. In particular, this is chapter 6 of The Prince. Machiavelli, I mean, and this is really a quite amazing chapter because he tells us that there are 4 great men in particular. Now, I've completely lost my notes because they're all over the place now. Okay, hold on. Page 33, which is book 6 of The Prince. This is where the title here is. Now, the title that Machiavelli uses, they're all in Latin, but he uses the modern Italian in the body of the text. There's a lot that can be made about that too, by the way. I'm hoping to do a space on that, but what I was working with one of my other clients about, which was so fun. But it's called Of New Principates, which by one's own arms and virtue are acquired. And here's what he says. He says, I mean, I don't have time to read the whole from sort of beginning to run up to this because I'm almost at the hour mark. But what he says is, he goes, but in order to come to those who have become princes by their own virtue and not by fortune, in other words, by their own excellence, remember that's the word, the Greek word virtue, excellence. He says, I say that the most excellent, so the best of the best, are Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. And then he says, and the like, right? And the like. Well, let's pay attention to who he took the time to actually name. That tells us right there that we need us some Plutarch, and we need us some Theseus and some Romulus. Now, there's a little bit more that should be said here. Let's see, my good friend Ancient is in here, and I, of course, always offer him a mic because he has so much that he can provide us with about Plutarch. But this is what he says, and again, this is another reason why this topic is so important for our understanding of the founders. He says these men and those like them, which is not very many. He says who became princes by virtuous ways, in other words, without any other help except their own arms, right? Whatever that means, their own weaponry. Now, it's going to turn out that weaponry involves the mind every bit as much as the body. That's later. But he says these, through their own virtuous ways, acquire the principate with difficulty. He says, but they hold it with facility, with ease. He says, and the difficulties which they have in acquiring the principate arise in part from the new orders and modes. Now, in other words, the new modes and orders. That's a very famous phrase from Machiavelli. New modes and orders. That's what he's talking about, founding. He says, from the new modes and orders that they are forced to introduce to found their state and security. And he says, one ought to consider, I mean, anytime Machiavelli speaks in a universal way, you stop and you listen and then you think for a very long time. He says, and one ought to consider, in other words, you reader should stop and think about this. Nothing is more difficult to deal with, nor more dubious of success, nor more dangerous to manage than making oneself the head in the introduction of new orders. So the most dangerous, I mean, listen to these superlatives. the most dangerous, the most difficult, and the most dubious of success is to be a founder. That's what he's telling us. And he's told us, he said, reflect on that, reader. And he said, now look back, and what has he told us? He said, well, there's 4 of them in particular that stand out the most. And just to say them again: Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. Now, Cyrus is particularly important because of all of the classical authors that you would think Machiavelli would go out of his way to recommend to his readers to read. The only one that he says, there's only one classical author who Machiavelli ever says you need to go read, and that's Xenophon, and in particular, The Education of Cyrus. So you have to ask yourself, is he talking about Xenophon, Cyrus, or Xenophon more broadly? A good case can be made that he's talking about Xenophon more broadly. I mean, and this we discover this in Nietzsche, by the way. But that's the issue there. That's the key. So that's why this is so important. Now, Hobbes is, well, hold on a second. Then there's also I just want to mention in passing the thing about Shakespeare. This is why Shakespeare is so important. It turns out that, well, it seems to be the case that Shakespeare was in fact writing through his plays a history of the English-speaking people. And we see that with the Greek plays in the following way. You have A Midsummer's Night Dream, which is effectively the founding of Athens. So again, think Theseus. You have Troilus and Cressida. That's Shakespeare's version of the Trojan War. You have Timon of Athens. Now that's going to be Shakespeare's version of the Peloponnesian War. And then you have Pericles. I mean, it's rare that I come across people who even know that Shakespeare wrote a play called Pericles. They just don't know. And what's going on there is that's the end of the Hellenic age for Shakespeare, and it becomes very clear because in the play, what happens is that King Antiochus, right, is going to send out an assassin to kill Pericles. And we know that Antiochus was the very last of the Greek kings of the East before the Romans came. Now, we're also going to get a hint at what's to come beyond the Romans, which is to say the coming of Christianity, which is to say Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, because the beginning of the play Pericles, now I say this because the life of Pericles is so incredibly important, so very important for Plutarch, is that the opening of the play, everyone is there, all the courtiers are there to wed Antiochus' beautiful daughter. And she's referred to there at one point as this celestial tree. And so we have this echo of a kind of biblical echo there, the celestial tree, right? The tree of good and evil. And so that's not to say that's what's going on there. I'm just offering that as I grant Shakespeare the benefit of the doubt that he was in full command of his plays and knew exactly what he was doing. And so if you follow that, there's a good way to see that that's what's going on. And Pericles it's going to turn out Pericles is absolutely crucial, the life of Pericles for the Federalists and the founders, for a whole host of reasons. So I have just hit the 1 hour mark. Now I'm going to start wrapping it up here in just a second. But let me point out that what's going on in the Pericles and why this is important for Plutarch and in particular the life of Theseus and Romulus is what's at issue there seems to be the love of the beautiful. That's how it begins, the love of the beautiful. And the question is if that's going to remain, right? Because with the death of Pericles, so too is the death of the Hellenic age. And now the Rome is coming on board. So what's going to happen to this love of the beautiful? Well, this is where Plutarch becomes invaluable. Because when Plutarch provides his juxtaposition of the life of Theseus and the life of Romulus, it turns out that one of the most defining characteristics of Theseus was his love of the beautiful. In fact, he has eros for the beautiful. And when you contrast that to Romulus, nowhere does Plutarch speak of Romulus having eros or love for anything that's similar to the beautiful. In fact, you have something very different, but just as absolutely important. You have the role of necessity. What Plutarch tells us, and this is just amazing, is he says that this is at the opening of the life of Theseus. He says Theseus was the founder, the orchestra of beautiful and far sung. Now, I don't particularly like that translation of far sung, but he says Theseus is the founder, the orchestin of beautiful and far sung Athens. And with Romulus, what he says in that same sentence is he says Romulus was the father, the patri. So you have Theseus as a founder, Romulus is a father. He says Romulus is the father of invincible and glorious. In other words, the Greek there is megalodoxon. In other words, the superlative of doxa or opinion, well known throughout the world, one could say, of Rome. Now, again, this is where I direct everyone to, again, Dominated by Dig Dug and my friend Ancient Philosophy. The translations, even in the Loeb, are just, they're not acceptable. You're not going to see very much. It's even going to, it turns out it's even worse because they start using words like unrealistic or unreality. That's terrible because you might very well miss something that's crucial with what's being said there. And so, for instance, he tells us that in that same sentence about the fact that Theseus was the founder of beautiful and far sung Athens, and Romulus was the father of invincible and glorious Rome. He says, these are the two most illustrious cities. Romulus built, skitesi, right? That's the Greek there. I don't know. My pronunciation is terrible, but I don't care. Romulus built Rome. Theseus, on the other hand, joined together households. Now, the word there is really important. Synoikomus. Now, the reason that's important is because the soon, meaning with, joining, the oikos is the household. That's going to be what's definitive of the difference between these two cities. Theseus joins together households. He has now. What's I laugh about this, but I mean, it is kind of funny. If you're not laughing when you're reading the great books, you're not reading them carefully enough, because very often these things are funny because they shock our fashionable and rather lazy sensibilities. Both of these two activities are grounded in large-scale rapes. It's just that's what has to happen of necessity in the case of Romulus, but one could also say of necessity in the case of Theseus because he's joining together these households, and for a number of reasons that you'll see as you read through the various lives there, is that they have to bring in the way that one joins in a way that is unbreakable households is to have a kind of degree of family ties, right? Familial bonds, and so that's going to be what's going to happen there with these women who get brought into or joined in on the one hand with Athens and on the other hand with Rome through the raping and stuff. Because when their own people come to rescue them, the women don't want to go back. They say, no, we don't need to go back because we're family now. Right? We're family. Now, sort of that being said, though, going back to Machiavelli for a second, because remember, we're wondering how it is that there's this change, why it is that we today don't look at Plutarch the way our own founders did and say, we need to learn from these people. Why can't we do that? Why can't we, like John Adams, say, oh my God, when I read, Adams in particular was referring to Thucydides and Tacitus, or Tacitus, however you want to pronounce it, but no difference with Plutarch in the same sense. Adams, in fact, the case of Plutarch in the study of the families of the founders stands out most especially with the Adams family. I mean, the way that the Adams is passed down, Plutarch, from one generation to the next, from John to John Quincy to Henry, is that's a case study in greatness all its own. You want to know, you want to see the significance of a education in Plutarch. Look no further than the Adams family. But we have to, like today, people, it doesn't even register with them. They say, why should I even bother reading Plutarch, right? I mean, who cares, right? I mean, these people aren't even real or something like that, right? And Plutarch himself is wrestling with that at the opening of the text because he's already written other lives. He tells us he's already written other lives. Whoever was the chronicler, that, in other words, who put together the lives as we have it now, they put them together chronologically. But Plutarch tells us, he said, I've already written these other lives, and I wanted to see if I was able to go back even beyond what we know, anything that we know, to the great founders, right, of the most important cities ever, Athens and Rome. And so he's trying to figure out how to do that. And that brings up the question for us of, look, what do we have in our hands here? What are we looking at? What do we mean when we say this is history? Well, it's in the. This is one of those moments where you say it's in the name, man. The Greek word for history, historia, it means inquiry. That's it. What happens as the culmination of this long attempt to try to reconcile the new learning that we receive, going way, way back, really sort of what kicks off the Renaissance, but it's even before then. I mean, you go back to the so-called battle of the ancients and the moderns came to us by it's a poem written like in, I want to say it's either the 13th century or maybe the 14th, but I think it might be the 13th century. It's either the 1200s or the 1300s. There's this so-called battle between the ancients and the moderns on the question of books. Now you see right away that goes on for centuries because it comes to a kind of culmination with Jonathan Swift and his famous battle of the books in Sir So-and-so's library. In other words, the books come alive and they battle it out. The ancient books and the modern books, they have a war. But that's because this hasn't been right. The question is, are we to follow the role of the ancients or the moderns in this notion of what we think of as history? And it's going to turn out when Nietzsche puts an end to this, by the way, that's also why at the very same time, the element of tragedy surfaces as so all important. Because it turns out that if you're looking back at these things, the relevance of whether or not they are real, that's not really of primary concern. And if they're not real, then what you're trying to do in the attempt to imitate them or satiate your soul, as Nietzsche tells us, is something that's fundamentally tragic because it's not real in the sense that we think of something as real. But the whole point there with Nietzsche is that we don't know what is real. We don't know what's possible. Now, there's two ways to go here to sort of underscore that. Remember that the Federalists point back to Plutarch more than any other classical author. They also point back at Montesquieu more than anyone else as the most quoted modern author. Now that's important because they're talking about Montesquieu's spirit of the laws. And this is what Montesquieu himself has to tell us about this with regard to education. It's absolutely amazing. This is in book 1. Hold on, let me see. It's so large, it's parts and then books and then chapters and everything. But this is, it's titled The Difference in the Effect of Education Among the Ancients and Among Ourselves. In other words, the ancients and the moderns. And remember, this is the person who gives our founders the template for instance, trial by jury, separation of powers, and most importantly, the blueprint for how to create a culture of commerce, of trade. In other words, to get liberalism up and running off the ground. This is what he says. He says, most of the ancient peoples lived in governments that had virtue for their principle. He says, when that virtue was in full force, he says, things were done in those governments that we no longer see and that astonish our small souls. He says their education had another advantage over ours. He says it was never contradicted. He says in the last year of his life, now I always mess this name up because it's so long and multisyllabic, Epaminondas said, heard, saw, and did. So keep that as an itemized list. He said, he heard, he saw, and he did the same things as at the same time that he was instructed in them. In other words, no deviation between these things. Montesquieu says, today we receive 3 different or opposing educations. So in other words, that's what the unity of education should be. That what is said to one and what one hears and what one sees and what one does, these things all happen at the same time. They don't deviate. But what Montesquieu says is, he says, today we receive 3 different and opposing educations. He says that of our fathers, that of our schoolmasters, and that of the world. And you can replace world with the word culture. He says what we are told by the last, in other words, what we are told by the world or what we're told by culture, upsets. And I'd like to check the Greek or the French on that because I'm pretty sure it's a lot stronger than upsets. But he says what we're told by the last, in other words, our third education, the education of culture, of the world around us, upsets all the ideas of the first 2 combined. He says this comes partly from the opposition there is for us between the ties of religion and those of the world. And then he says that was a thing unknown among the ancients. But you see, Montesquieu is fundamentally a modern. And so he's not going back. He's not, now this is the very beginning of the text. He's not, he's looking back. He says, we're going forward. We don't have a choice. The religious wars just caused too much damage. Millions were slaughtered in the name of Christianity. Christians slaughtering other Christians in the name of Christianity. It's really no different than what you see going on in the various theology spaces on X. But what Montesquieu says is they had better souls than us because their education was not disrupted. The thing that they had that we don't was the tie between religion and culture. We don't have that, is what Montesquieu says. But what Montesquieu then proceeds to do for the next roughly 400, 500 pages is provide the blueprint for how to go forward with that radical upsetting or deviation. We could call it a Caesarian moment, right? A Caesar moment. Now, so that's where things stand with Montesquieu. And what's so fascinating, I mean, there's more that I wanted to read there because it's even on the opening page The opening page of Montesquieu's text, Montesquieu, in many ways, I mean, we're now getting the role of modern scholarship in books, and Montesquieu himself provides a footnote. This is page 1 of book 1 in his book that the founders quoted more than any other modern. The footnote is to Plutarch. He cites Plutarch on page 1. That's how important this is. Now, I'm at an hour and I think 15 minutes now, so I'm going to draw a hard cut here in a second. I wish I could have gotten more into Plutarch himself, but again, we have to have an understanding of what we're dealing with. I want to say some things about Hobbes and then Rousseau, but this is too important to be left aside. We need to know, why is this so different for us? Why can't we do this? Why can't we be John Adams? As he kept Plutarch, he tells us, Adams tells us, he kept a copy of Plutarch with him when he was the first ambassador. I think it was to Russia or something like that, and he would read Plutarch on the ship. Why can't we, like John Adams, read Plutarch and then put Plutarch down and look at the world around us and say, I see all these people, right? I see the kinds of failures and the warnings that Plutarch gives us, and I also see the various greatness, or we could say heroism or human excellence, or maybe I don't see it and I want to see it, so I'm going to try to live it. Why can't we do that? Well, with the rise of history as its own field of study, remember what I told you, the Greek word for history just means inquiry. Scientific history makes a distinction. You have on the one hand the method of inquiry, and then you have on the other hand the objects of the inquiry. Now, notice the problem, though, is sort of inherent there. There's an inherent tension because the same word's being used, inquiry, history. So in other words, the method of history versus the object of history. The method of inquiry or the method of history, that gets called historiography. You know, that's what is your method? How are you going about interpreting things? Well, what are the things you're interpreting? Well, those are the objects of your inquiry. We tend to call those things facts. Now, there's a problem with that, though, because even with the Latin word for fact, I mean, this thing we know of as fact is not, it's not at all as clear, or the same we call object or objective. These things are not nearly as clear. In fact, they're more fiction than anything than we'd like to believe. That's why you never want to say something is objectively true or factually true or something like that. See, that's the difference that modern science makes. Plutarch, along with basically everybody else prior to the 19th century, they didn't draw that hard distinction between the two. They would not consider it to be any kind of criticism if someone said, hey, you're conflating your objects of inquiry with your methods of inquiry. They say, I know I am. That's the point. Because what we know of as history came out of the faculty known as rhetoric. And what's the purpose of rhetoric? Well, that's where things get fun. Now, we could say that the great divide on this thing known as history versus rhetoric occurs on the one hand with Aristotle and the Poetics. Aristotle tells us that poetry is more philosophical than history. He gives us reasons for why, and I don't have time to go into it now. I've got all the notes and everything. This will be, like I said, this is, if you enjoy this, go to my Athens Corner website, subscribe, because I'm going to satiate your soul with all of this there. You'll get tired of hearing about it. I have so much to say about it. But that's Aristotle. Polybius is going to say something different. In fact, what Polybius says, this is in the Histories, this is book 2. He says, tragedy seeks to excite and please the audience. He says, history seeks to instruct and persuade serious students. So in other words, these things are fundamentally different somehow. And in the very next sentence, Polybius says, poetry's goal is to beguile, to fool the spectator, even if what is said is not true. And the really great divide, we could say, now that's Polybius. The really great divide, we could say, comes from Cicero. This is it gets translated in different ways. The translation I have is on the ideal orator, which I just don't think that's a good translation. But this is what Cicero has to tell us. He's providing a dialogue, and he's trying to get at what this thing, the rhetorician, is. And he says, this is in book 2. Let me make sure I've got this down right. And again, the translations of these things are just terrible. That's why it's important to know Greek and Latin if you want to do these things seriously. But he's talking about there's 3 kinds of rhetoric. And he brings up Aristotle. And then he goes a little bit further, and I'll just pick up there. And he says, this is the person these are all characters, right? These are, so we can't necessarily say it's Cicero, but I mean, I think all indications are that this would be Cicero's opinion because it's the one who's teaching about what rhetoric is supposed to do. He says, but I return to my point. He goes, do you see how great a task history is for the orator? He says, it may in fact be the greatest task in terms of fluency of diction and variety. He says, and still I don't find that the rhetoricians have anywhere furnished it with rules of its own. He says, for its rules are obvious. He says, now this is key. He says, everyone knows the first law of history is not daring to say anything false. And he says, and everyone knows that the second law of history, again, these are probably bad translations, I just didn't have time to check them. He says, the second law of history is daring to say everything that is true. And he says, and the third is that there should be no suggestion of partiality, none of animosity when you write. He's talking about you should have no political bias. Now, that's interesting because this is where Hobbes, in many ways, enters the fray. And Hobbes is entering the fray here because Hobbes has found enormous value in Thucydides. And this is something I go into just enormous detail in the sequel to my Thucydides recording that I'm about to release on the website. What Hobbes says this in De Civ, which is to say on the Citizen. Let me see if I don't want to try to hunt it down in my book. I know I've got it written somewhere in my notes right here. Oh yes, this is wonderful. It's kind of hard not to love Hobbes because of he trashes rhetoric in a rhetorical way, which is amazing, right? I mean, he says, don't do this, and I'm doing it, right? With spectacular excellence, greatness, right? Hobbes says, all the philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Seneca, Plutarch, he says, and the rest of the maintainers of the Greek and Roman anarchies, Hobbes is positioning himself against all of that. And it's because he's deeply, deeply concerned with what he refers to himself as the nature itself of eloquence. And he says, the tongue of man is a trumpet of war and sedition. And that's why you have to be so careful when you're able to pull it off in a beautiful way, which is to say, an eloquent way. Again, that's the pull of the beautiful, which is to say, in the role of these things, these speeches, that we have. And sort of going back to what I mentioned at the very beginning, Athens is representative of, through Theseus, because of the deeds that Plutarch is very careful to explain to us. Theseus loves the beautiful, and that ends up being definitive of Athens. We find this in none other than Pericles' oration, his funeral oration in Thucydides. But Plutarch has a lot to say about that as well. This also explains to us how it is there's a tension there, because, see, Hobbes is right in many ways, and the founders know that. So they've got to find a way of founding, and they're doing it in a way that's quite beautiful with this reference to Plutarch. But they've got to do it in a way that has stability, right? In other words, how do you establish, how do you found something so that it lasts? And it's got to have that power of the beautiful, but at the same time, it also has to speak to the problem of necessity. And that's the position that Hobbes is coming from, because that's the position he finds in Thucydides. Thucydides explains this to us just amazingly. And the way that Thucydides does this is he shows us that there is an alternative, in many respects, to the Platonic and the Aristotelian tradition regarding the notion of the speeches, because the Greek word for speeches is logoi. So Thucydides is offering us an alternative to the life of the logos. That's why Nietzsche is turning back to Thucydides. But this is every bit as much alive and well in Plutarch. And the founders see this. Our founders see this. They have a lot to say about it, because this role of faction, that's what Hobbes says rhetoric causes faction. And in particular, Plutarch causes faction. The founders, again, were rifling through Plutarch to find their pseudonyms, because they knew how beautiful and how amazing, captivating, intoxicating these things had on educated, thoughtful men. Another way to say that is they knew the power of images. Now, what's so amazing about that is that actually takes us back into Plato and Aristotle. And I'll just sort of leave this hanging here. I won't go into it, because this is what I'm going to go into with some recordings I've got lined up for Machiavelli. What Machiavelli does is Machiavelli, and Hobbes gets this from Machiavelli, by the way. This is the tradition that he's coming from. Machiavelli inaugurates the elimination of images in logos. Hobbes is going in that tradition because the power of images over the human imagination is just too powerful. They've got to find a way, on the one hand, to harness it, because that's how they succeed in their political endeavors. But at the same time, they've got to harness it and do it so that no one comes after them and redoes it. This is going to be a tension in the West, because you have this issue of progress on the one hand. This is Thomas Jefferson's great problem. Jefferson argues for a kind of refounding of the country basically every so many decades, because he believes so much in progress. But the difference there is with Madison, et cetera, and Adams, is they're going to say, no, this has to be enduring. And in particular, what they see is that they recognize the power of the images, in particular Madison, because you have to understand what happens in the debates, the constitutional debates, is that they're so dependent upon, for instance, the Greeks and the Romans, the lives of the Greeks and the Romans, which is to say Plutarch. The Federalists are arguing on behalf of confederacies that are centralized. The Anti-Federalists are against that. They're saying, no, if you centralize things, that's where you get problems. And what happens is that it turns out that the Federalists rely very heavily on the examples from Greece of decentralized confederacies that fall apart. This is the Peloponnesian War. That's why Athens and Sparta go to war. The confederacy they formed was what defeated the Persians. But then that falls apart because they couldn't keep it. It was too decentralized, and when they tried to centralize it, I mean, that's my whole series on Thucydides. But at the same time, the Anti-Federalists say, okay, we can do this too, and they use examples from Rome of how the Roman Republic, which was centralized, fell apart. And the just truly amazing thing about this is that it turns out Plutarch once again to the rescue. Okay, well, how? Well, this is just fascinating. There was no tradition in England of centralized confederacies. In fact, and it's even worse than that. Our founders had to re-inaugurate the notion of founding. What you had in England was the tradition of Edmund Burke. And with Burke, you almost in many ways get and it's going to be sealed for good after Burke with Hegel, is that these things develop organically, right? There's no founder per se. There's just it's a people that's always been there. Now, Plutarch puts the lie to that very well, both with Theseus and Romulus. One could even say Thucydides does it first with the notion of Greekness in the archaeology, but I talk about that in the recording. But what happens is that they end up arguing, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists end up arguing over what we see happen in, for instance, at least the life of Themistocles in Plutarch. And this is the Amphictyonic League. I mean, I bet you've probably never even heard of that before. But this is truly amazing. I mean, take for instance, John Jay is going to really drive this home in Federalist 4. Hamilton is going to take his own stab at it in Federalist 6. And then Madison is going to run just exhausted in Federalist 18. And what the Amphictyonic League was the only example that they could really find in antiquity of a confederation that was centralized that had success. But then the question becomes one of interpretation. Was it really what they were trying to claim that it was, or was it not? And I just don't have time to read this, but I wanted to read this. All three of these people, and also including in the constitutional debates themselves. I mean, I have all of this stuff in front of me on my notes. I don't have time to read it because I've got to come to a hard break here. John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and Madison, they all go into explicit detail of what they're finding in Plutarch on this Amphictyonic League. And it brings us back to just how important it is to know what we are even holding in our hands when we're reading Plutarch, or when we're reading Livy, or when we're reading Polybius. And I have a way that I can show you that this is all very much alive and well, not simply in Aristotle, but most especially in Plato. And if you're not already bald, I could tell you, and it'll blow the hair right off of your head. I don't have time to do that, though, unfortunately. I have to draw a hard break now. I can't have these really long recordings anymore. And also, if you'd like to hear more about all of this, because I've got a ton to say, then there's my website. Like I said, it's up there in the nest. You can subscribe either at either link. I also, by the way, have two of them are done. I've got a couple more that I'm waiting on. But what I've done is I've had a professional editor, copyright editor, go through the actual transcripts, put them into a PDF publish-worthy form, and they are time-stamped with all of the recordings. And so I don't have those available yet. I mean, I have them, but they're not available to put together with the recordings yet. But that's where we're headed. So what I'm told, and I understand this because I'm the same way, is that it took a number of people at least 2 weeks and about 4 or 5 listenings to my Thucydides recording to really let it sink in, because I don't fool around on the recordings. It takes me so long to get them done because I don't waste a single second of your time. They are jam-packed. Every single sentence, we're talking deep textual citation, along with what I like to consider is a completely different kind, not even a different in degree, but a completely different kind of mastery over the subject than you've probably been familiar with. So people have always said, they're like, man, I really would like to, read this while I'm going along with it. So hear you talk about it while I'm reading it. Well, now I have those. I have those available. So not for sale yet or available in that sense, but that's where we're going. Hopefully by the end of the summer, I'll have all of them. But I mean, some of these things are a couple hundred pages. Well, let's see, the Thucydides one I think was a little over 100 pages. The one for Homer and the Shield of Achilles, I think that was like 55 pages. The one on Nietzsche's Overman, I think, was something like 19 or 20 pages. But again, I personally think that my best work is still to come with the sequel to Thucydides, with the turn to speeches, and also especially with what I've got coming down on Nietzsche. Because you have to understand, what I'm including in the Nietzsche recording is an entire history of how this came about with regard to this entire field of study that doesn't even exist anymore, philology, and how it was the foundation for knowledge simply. Now let that sink in, because that includes science. Science itself, what we understand as modern science, originates in and is sustained by and given flight by this other field of study that has to do with interpretation of old texts, languages, words themselves, and moving from one language to another. And Nietzsche doesn't inaugurate it. Nietzsche is the culmination of it. He ends it. And that's where we find ourselves in many respects today. But again, I mean, it's amazing. Let's see, I'm sitting here looking at all the quotes I didn't get to read from Quintilian. Quintilian has some great stuff. I'm looking at not only the Republic, but also Plato's Laws, Rousseau, some stuff in Shakespeare. I just didn't get a chance to get to any of this. But again, in the recordings that I provide, I take my time, and you're going to hear all of it. So, all right. So I think I'll just call it a night there. I hope everyone had a wonderful 4th of July. And I really wanted to do this discussion, because that's what we're celebrating. That's what's so definitive about this world that we live in now, is that America was founded. Founding was made great again by our founders. They didn't even have a tradition of it in England. And to the extent that it was beginning to develop in Germany, which would soon take over the world, it would make doing what our founders did impossible. So we are exceptional. We are very exceptional. And unfortunately, most of us don't even know that today. And we don't even know where to turn to read to find out about it. And it's all right there. I mean, the Amphictyon League. I mean, who would have guessed, right? Um, all from Plutarch. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a lot more going on here. There's Sallust. I've got a couple quotes from Sallust, Quintilian, uh, Tacitus, Polybius, Livy, of course. Machiavelli's discourses on Livy, right? All of these things are there, uh, but Plutarch stands out most especially, and for very, very good reasons, because he is showing us the most spectacular display of the beautiful that we have from Greece and then from Rome. And with that, those various conjunctions, those juxtapositions of those excellencies, we have a better way of considering going forward when the Greek polis is no longer an option. It's just not there. And by the way, Plutarch is also extremely important in the so-called pastoral movement. Pastoralism, right? The notion of agriculture and the land and things. I mean, this is where Thomas Jefferson really, really brings Plutarch back into the scene. We know that today. I mean, we're seeing it all over the timeline with the various land movements and stuff like that. All of that originates. We're getting so very much of that. Oh, Virgil comes in as well with a lot of this, and Horace too, right? Horace is there. Um, uh, but again, all of this again comes out of serious readings of Plutarch. I mean, that's just how relevant all of this is. I mean, you wouldn't otherwise think about it, but it's because we've got to find a way. Not everyone, but some people. It only takes a few. Have to find a way to get back to something like John Adams writing to his friends saying, "My God, everywhere I look now, all I see are the people from Thucydides, Tacitus, Plutarch. It's all there." I mean, this is I like to say this about Homer. Everything's in Homer. It's all there. Everything is in Homer. And in fact, the better you become at reading, which is to say, the more slowly you read, the more seriously you read, the more you learn the knowledge of the language itself to find out what's even being said, the more it is that with all of these various great books, you find out they're great because everything is there. I look at Thucydides now and I can say the same thing I used to say about Homer. It's all there. Everything's there. And then I can put Thucydides down and I can pick up Plato and I can say, my God, it's all here too. It's just that in many cases they're contrary, but you can understand why they're going against each other. You can see it. And so you have alternatives. That's the key. This thing that we call history is like driving a car forward when you can't see through the windshield. All you can look at is the rearview mirror. And it turns out that the rearview mirror is more important than what you could have probably seen through the windshield. Because it could be the case that your historical circumstances make it to where what you see through the windshield can't even hold a candle to what's in the rearview mirror. And so you want to get back what's in the rearview mirror. How do you do that? Well, you have to know that they even existed. Or if they didn't exist, right? I mean, that's the question of history. Is it the case that even if they didn't exist, we still might be able to make something like that possible? And so then their true existence is irrelevant. Doesn't matter. I mean, the example of the founders with this is I think it's the old adage where they say that George Washington was so honest he couldn't tell a lie and he chopped down the cherry tree, right? And he told his parents, they said, what happened to the cherry tree? It has been felled. And he says, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree. I don't think that's real. I think that's just apocrypha. But the fact is, it gives us something to aspire towards. That's more important. So, all right, great. Call it a night there. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Well, hopefully I'll see you again in these spaces pretty soon. But if you don't see me, it's because I'm working away at the much bigger, more focused things that I'm doing on the website. So again, you can subscribe to that by the links in my bio and such that are up there in the nest. So take care.